Let's move on to another important issue here, and that's Palestinian political prisoners, something you don't hear a lot about. You're hearing a lot about hostages. You're hearing very little about Palestinian political prisoners. So to discuss this topic more, we are very, very honored to be joined once again by Amanda Yee, who is an editor of liberationnews.org and the host of Radio Free Amanda. Amanda, thank you so much for being back with us.
Hey, Eugene. Hey, Rania. It's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
No, of course, the pleasure is all ours. And I guess just to start, since I think people probably are hearing very little about the issue of Palestinian political prisoners, maybe just give us a capsule view of what the situation is vis-a-vis political prisoners in Palestine.
Yeah, so we've been hearing a lot about the Hamas hostages recently, right? And the media has really framed this as a hostage crisis. But the nonstop spotlight on the 200 Israeli prisoners compared with the total disregard for what is now over 10,000 Palestinian political prisoners in Israel is a perfect example of the double standard that Palestinians are always subjected to. What people don't understand when they talk about the 200 people held by Hamas and the 30 or 40 held by Islamic Jihad is that there was already a hostage crisis underway long before the resistance launched its October 7th operation. You never hear about the thousands of Palestinian detainees held captive in Israeli jails. Before the Al-Aqsa flood operation, before October 7th, the number of Palestinians detained in Zionist prisons was around 5,000, 5,200. 170 of those were children. These figures are from Adamir, which is a prisoner support NGO based in Ramallah in the West Bank. But since the start of the resistance counteroffensive, that number has doubled to 10,000. After the launch of Al-Aqsa flood, the IDF immediately arrested 4,000 Palestinian workers from Gaza who had special work permits to work in Israel, and they've been holding them on military bases ever since. They've also been arresting thousands of Palestinians in overnight army raids across the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And this 10,000 figure that I mentioned a few seconds ago, this figure is from a few weeks ago. So we can estimate that it's even higher now as Israel has escalated its war. The IDF is constantly making arrests now, just 24/7, left and right. Under the occupation, under normal circumstances, the IDF makes around 15 to 20 arrests a day. Since October 7th, that arrest rate has jumped to 120 a day. A lot of these Palestinian detainees are in administrative detention, which means they're being held indefinitely without charge or trial. This is a practice that has been kept in place since the British Mandate era. When they do go to trial, they go through a separate legal system, right? Because it's apartheid. So Israel has a dual legal system. One is for Israelis and one is for Palestinians in occupied West Bank. If an Israeli is arrested, they are tried in Israeli civil court. If a Palestinian who doesn't hold Israeli citizenship is arrested, they are tried in Israeli military court. So what's the difference? Well, military courts limit your access to lawyers and legal protections, and it is much, much easier to convict someone in Israeli military court than civilian court. Just in general, imprisonment among Palestinians is a remarkably common experience, especially among Palestinian men. It's estimated that 2 in 5 Palestinian men will be imprisoned within their lifetime. Not even children are spared, right? It's well documented that children are arrested for really minor things like throwing stones at IDF tanks. They're detained and often interrogated without the presence of their families or without the presence of a lawyer. And they're frequently subjected to physical and sexual abuse and psychological torture. So yeah, this was already a hostage crisis long before Hamas took the 200 detainees on October 7th. And it's these captives that Hamas is trying to use as leverage to secure the release of all the Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli jails right now. And that has been their demand from day one. And in the last few weeks, we have seen calls from progressive politicians, human rights groups like Human Rights Watch, as well as the UN, and they have all been calling for the release of these so-called hostages. Like even the corporate media use of the word hostage to describe the Hamas detainees is a political choice because, an exchange of prisoners is normal in armed conflict, but by calling the Hamas detainees hostages, it raises the demand for their unconditional release with no mention of the 10,000 Palestinian political prisoners that are in jails right now in Israel, which is disingenuous and dishonest. And in fact, last week, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, he made his first public statement in 6 months, and he announced that he was immediately ready to make a deal that includes the release of all the Hamas detainees for the release of all detainees held in Israeli prisons. And, there's precedent for this, right? In 2011, Hamas released one IDF soldier, Gilad Shalit, who they'd held captive for 5 years. They exchanged one IDF soldier for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. And like even the families of the captives held by Hamas right now are calling on the Israeli government to accept this deal, but Netanyahu refuses to do so. Instead, Israel's choosing to prioritize retaliation against Hamas and carpet bombing Gaza over the safe release of the detainees, which isn't surprising in the least because Israel would rather kill the hostages, their own citizens, and rescue them. And they have a history of doing so, right? They have a military directive. It's called the Hannibal Directive. And this directive states that it's preferable to kill an IDF soldier than allow him to be taken captive. Because if he's taken captive, then he becomes a political problem for the Israeli government. Because then public pressure starts to arise for the government to negotiate with Hamas for their release. And they would rather not do so.
And it should be noted that according to Hamas, 50 of the detainees in Hamas custody have been, and maybe other custody as well throughout Gaza, have been killed by the Israelis bombing them.
Mhm.
Not to mention that we've heard the stories from some Israelis who were present on October 7th and made it out alive, and said that it was their side that was causing casualties and even shelling houses, um,
Mhm.
and basically just trying to kill everyone. And if that is true, that would be consistent with the Hannibal Directive. But rather than using that against soldiers, they were using that against, their own civilians. What are the conditions that we know about for Palestinian detainees? These thousands of people being held in
Mhm.
Israeli detention.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting because, you mentioned last week these two Israeli detainees, they were two elderly women. They had been held by Hamas for um, like since the start of the October 7th operation. And so one of the detainees, the day after she was released, she was admitted to a hospital and she held a press conference. And she and the other detainee were actually released on humanitarian grounds because Hamas could no longer provide the medical care that they needed while in captivity. But at this press conference, she talked about the treatment that she had received from the Hamas militants while in captivity. They would be visited by doctors and given whatever medication that they needed. And that is in stark contrast to the conditions for Palestinian detainees, right? Um, Within Israeli jails, prisoners are often deprived of family visits. They're denied access to medication. Beatings are really commonplace. Psychological torture is commonplace. They're punished with solitary confinement and sleep deprivation. Um, like hunger strikes are really common among Palestinian prisoners as a way to draw attention to what they're subjected to. Like in August of this year, 1,000 Palestinian prisoners across Israel staged a hunger strike to protest the brutal conditions and abuse that they faced at the hands of Israeli prison authorities. And, earlier this year, there was a campaign for a political prisoner named Walid Daka. He's one of the many political prisoners that a lot of these Palestinian groups have been trying to bring attention to. And he's being held hostage in Israeli detention. He's 61 years old, and he's been imprisoned for almost 40 years, since 1986. And last year, in December of 2022, Daka was actually diagnosed with an advanced form of bone marrow cancer. And Daka has faced really severe medical negligence from Israeli prison authorities, including repeated delays in treatment and the denial of an urgent bone marrow transplant. And all of this has led to serious deterioration in his health. But Daka is just one example where Israel denies medical treatment in order to silence or kill Palestinian political dissidents. And since the launch of the resistance operation in October, Israel has really escalated the abuse. Immediately after Al Aqsa flood, the Israelis cut off electricity and water to Palestinian detainees as a form of collective punishment for the operation. And Palestinian prisoners' rights groups have been reporting much higher incidences of physical abuse and beatings within these jails. But all of this is hardly ever mentioned in US media.
Yeah, I mean, it's really not mentioned at all, quite frankly, in terms of U.S. media. And I mean, I think some of it also, of course, is the framing of who they are. That they're a bunch of terrorists. I mean, think about Marwan Barghouti, of course, who many people call the Nelson Mandela of Palestine. I mean, it's in many ways quite similar, I would say, to the ANC and PAC detainees during that era of apartheid. And it just seems to speak so much, Amanda, to the framing of the whole conflict, right? Because, of course, we look back in history and everyone says these were the great freedom fighters of South Africa. These are the people who were fighting for the freedom of the Irish. But of course, at the time and in the moment, it was like, these are the worst people on the planet Earth and we must hold them in prison. And that, of course, frames how then people themselves view the overall conflict in a broader sense.
Yeah. So the common refrain that I've often heard is that you can't compare the ones detained by Hamas to the Palestinian prisoners because the Hamas hostages are largely innocent civilians, whereas the Palestinians, presumably they're detained for so-called terrorist activities, right? That's the assumption. But we have to ask ourselves, why are so many Palestinians held captive by Israel? And the reason for that is because after the 1967 war, after Israel gained control of and occupied Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, it started issuing military orders. It issued one military order, which is still in place today, that essentially criminalizes any form of political dissent against the state of Israel. So under this military order, it's illegal for Palestinians to organize and participate in protests. It's illegal to distribute any kind of dissenting political material. It's even illegal to wave a Palestinian flag. So because of that, the IDF arrests thousands of Palestinians every year for resisting the occupation, even by, nonviolent measures. And so after a few years after this military order was issued, they issued another military order in 1970, actually. And that classified any kind of resistance to the occupation as terrorism. And so over the decades, Israel has issued more and more military orders imposing more and more restrictions on Palestinian rights and Palestinian political expression. And these military orders are separate from and take precedence over Israeli law and international law. And this is another facet of the apartheid system, right? Palestinians are governed by entirely different laws than Israelis. And these military orders are why you have children arrested for throwing stones or talking back to an IDF soldier, and how, IDF soldiers basically have license to arrest anyone with impunity, right? IDF soldiers terrorize entire towns in Palestine through raids, going from house to house, arresting people. House raids, and especially house raids in the middle of the night, are incredibly common in the West Bank. If I can tell a story, a while ago when I was in college, I volunteered for a summer for this youth center that was located in the Ada refugee camp in the West Bank. It was in Bethlehem. It was an arts and culture center for children of the camp. And they taught kids photography and painting and theater and art. And all of this was a way to help them cope with a lot of the trauma that they had developed just living under occupation and seeing so much violence every day. So one morning, we were all in the dining area eating breakfast together. And we were eating breakfast before beginning that day's work. And the director of the center came in looking visibly upset. And he started telling us that the night before, at like 3 a.m, the camp had been raided by IDF soldiers. And these soldiers went from house to house at 3 a.m. They were looking for this kid, this teenager that lived in the camp, and they wanted to arrest him like for terrorist activities, right? So they went from house to house looking for him. And when everyone kept telling them that they didn't know where he was, the soldiers got really angry and they started just shooting indiscriminately into the air, just terrorizing everyone in the camp. So obviously everyone in the camp was really upset and traumatized from the night before. And the director told us that story. Everyone, was of course like still trying to kind of cope with what had happened the night before. And I remember, like, after we finished breakfast, I was walking by myself to the corner store to grab a bottle of water before beginning the day's work. And I just remember looking down at the ground, and there were just empty bullet casings just all over the place, just like scattered all over the ground, like all across the refugee camp. And also, like, this youth center had a back area, and part of our job was to clear it out and turn it into a playground for the kids. There was a lot of trash and debris there, and we'd spend a lot of time just picking it up, and we would find all over the place rubber bullets from IDF soldiers. They call them rubber bullets, but the ones that the IDF uses are actually steel bullets encased in rubber. And they can like still inflict real damage and real injury. And they use these rubber bullets to like disperse demonstrations. And actually, one of the Palestinians we worked with at the center and who lived in the refugee camp, he was a photographer and a videographer. And a few years after I, worked at the center, he was documenting this protest in the West Bank. There were these protests there every week in this village because the Israelis were trying to build an extension of the apartheid wall in this village. So they were bulldozing olive fields to construct this wall. So one day he was documenting that week's protest, and a soldier shot at his camera with a rubber bullet, and the bullet ended up hitting him in the eye. And because of that, he was in the hospital for weeks. And these kinds of stories are incredibly common. It's incredibly common, and it just shows you the way that IDF soldiers arrest people and shoot demonstrators and act with complete impunity.
Yeah, I mean it's really amazing. That's the everyday reality for Palestinians, and I think as bad as most people think it is, it's 10 times worse. Well, as always, Amanda, really appreciate you joining us here on the show and helping us sort through all of this. Amanda Yee, editor of LiberationNews.org, host of Radio Free Amanda. As always, thank you for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.